I think we'll make a start. Thank you very much for joining us, and to those of you who haven't been to kind of the LEEPout seminar before, this is a monthly event, and as with kind of previous talks, we ask you to kind of keep muted throughout the presentation itself, and keep questions until the end. If you have any kind of points of clarification, feel free to put those in the chat, and we will interrupt Ben if we feel that's kind of appropriate, but we'll keep more discursive comments until the end. Just a reminder that the presentation is being recorded. So without kind of further ado, we'll kind of introduce Ben. He did his PhD at UCL in 2005, and now his research really focuses on the economics of biodiversity, as well as intra and intergenerational equity. So how we trade off equity amongst people alive today, but also amongst future generations. He was a professor at LSE before taking up a Dragon Capital Chair in Biodiversity Economics here at the University of Exeter. And today he's going to be talking to us about some of his really interesting ongoing research that looks at the impact of a moratorium on deforestation in Indonesia. So over to you, Ben.
I want to present this work, which has been extremely interesting to undertake with my friends and colleagues Lorenzo Silesci and Charles Palmer from the London School of Economics. We've been working on this for a while. Some of you may have seen a former incarnation of something related to this, where we looked at forest fires and so on. But we have for a long time been interested in trying to understand what works when it comes to halting deforestation, for the various reasons that you would want to look at that question, which include, of course, limiting emissions, carbon emissions, and of course limiting loss of biodiversity and so on. So our focus is on a particular policy that was implemented in 2011, a moratorium on oil palm, timber, and logging concessions in Indonesia. And this looked like a pretty reasonable place to start looking for successes or indeed failures. So the paper has the following results. So this is a kind of typical thing that happens in economics these days, because everyone knows that economists can't stand suspense. What they do is they tend to present the results first. Ben Balmford, can I assume that you're dealing with the waiting room?
Yeah, everyone's getting admitted. So.
Yeah. Terrific. Okay, thanks. So basically, this is what we do. We do a program evaluation of the moratorium. This is an area-based policy in Indonesia, in which areas were designated where concessions for oil palm, timber, and logging were no longer allowed in those particular areas. Okay, and it started in 2011. And of course, we want to see whether this treatment changes land uses at all and reduces deforestation. What we did is we used kind of program evaluation techniques, matched difference in differences and triple differences on the Hansen deforestation data. What we find is that the moratorium has reduced deforestation compared to the non-moratorium areas, against a background of really ongoing deforestation in those areas. We find there are no spillover effects, which is a key concern when it comes to area-based policies. You implement the policy in one place and it might be successful there, but you just transfer the activities somewhere else. We don't find any evidence for that. But the effects are pretty small. You're looking at between 3 and 1.8% of forested area has been avoided deforestation in this time period, 2011 to 2017. The annual carbon reduction associated with that is between 10 and 50 million tons of carbon dioxide, compared to the annual emissions, which are orders of magnitude higher. So that you're looking at sort of an effect on emissions of sort of 0.3, 1.4%. Or if you want to look at the target reduction that Indonesia has of 26% of business as usual emissions by 2020, it's about 1.7 to 7.8% of that target. So not really biting into that target. On the other hand, the Norwegians who paid for this, they're more or less getting their money's worth. What they anticipated in some respects, and I'll explain more about how that is. In terms of some background on deforestation in Indonesia, it's a significant thing globally as well as sort of regionally. So it's the world's 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. 75% of those emissions are coming from forest degradation and peatland drainage. There's about 45% of that is driven by oil palm, timber, and logging concessions, industries in Indonesia. Fire is usually used to clear the forests, and so, of course, this always tends to lead to carbon dioxide emissions. And while deforestation in this period between 2000 and 2012 was sort of declining in Brazil, which was a kind of a good news story, not that it was reversing, but the rates were declining in Brazil, which is a good news story. Actually, if you look at the global picture, according to the Hanson's paper in 2013, places like Indonesia were really reversing that, so reducing the net effect globally. So, and in the national emissions target for Indonesia is a 26% reduction compared to business as usual by 2020, and a 41% reduction by 2030. These are ambitious targets, and you can see, given what I've just said, that an obvious place to start for this would be to look at forestry and these industries. And this is more or less where the idea for the moratorium came along. This can all be thought of in terms of, a REDD+ type policy, the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And this is sort of a timeline of what's sort of happened here. In 2010, Norway and Indonesia sort of agreed to form a REDD+ partnership. $1 billion was pledged by the Norwegians to conditional on emissions reductions from deforestation. So in a way, this is like a performance-based, area-based policy for reducing carbon emissions from deforestation. You get paid for what you achieve, is the idea. And in 2011, this starts happening. The moratorium on the conversion of primary forests and peatland into new palm oil, timber, and logging concessions starts in earnest in designated areas. This is renewed every 2 years after the first implementation without really many major amendments. And then in 2017, just recently, at the end of 2017, peatland moratorium is expanded to the whole country. In 2018, the dryland oil palm moratorium happens outside of the original moratorium area. And in 2019, this is all made permanent rather than this sort of revolving renewal process that had been going up until this point. So then, very recently, based on an annual emissions reduction noticed measured in sort of annual deforestation reduction, a reduction in the rate of deforestation in 2018-2019, the Norwegians finally paid something out, $56 million to Indonesia for its recent performance there. Okay, and alongside in this policy space, you have the Green Climate Fund paying even more, $103 million. The Green Climate Fund is associated with the Copenhagen Agreement, and it's part of that kind of the Kyoto process. Was a fund that was set up for precisely this kind of emissions reduction strategy. So there's a lot going on in this space, and of course it raises the question as to whether or not the Norwegians are getting any value for money. Has this policy been successful over the past 8 or 9 years? Is the nature of the performance-based nature of the program really? Is Indonesia being rewarded with this money? What's going on there? That's really what motivated our research here. Okay. Some other things that are interesting about the moratorium. It's sort of it's essentially a ban, this area-based policy, but there are some loopholes there. And one of them is that, of course, it doesn't apply to existing concessions. So even if the concession is in the moratorium area, that concession within its land can still deforest its virgin forest. It doesn't apply to secondary forests, only primary and virgin forest. if there are food security or energy requirements, which are the sort of motivation for deforestation or the use of that or degradation of that area, those are typically overlooked and excluded from the moratorium. And then the other thing is that the moratorium area has been quite fluid. It's changed, it's become less strict. In certain places, it's moved a little bit here and there. And there's been, according to Charlie, by the way, I should have mentioned that Charlie Palmer is sort of the expert on Indonesia, certainly within our group, but more generally than that as well. According to Charlie, there's been a lot of kind of sort of maneuvering about the designation of particular pieces of land. Are they in the moratorium or are they not? Conversion to secondary forest, for instance, excludes the land from the moratorium. And there's lots of debate about whether or not particular pieces of land are part of the moratorium as well. So there's some activities going on there. So it's a bit of a moving sort of area, as it were. So that's the background to it all. You can see why this is an interesting question. You can see the oil palm plantation behind there. What about previous work? Well, there's a lot of work that's been done here. I'm only going to mention a couple of papers throughout all of this. But the sort of key motivation for us was a piece of work by Jonah Bush and colleagues like Hansen and so forth, which was in PNAS a long time ago. They analysed the moratorium back in 2015, so not so long ago. They analysed the moratorium, and but of course they only had data up to 2010, so they couldn't look at the post-moratorium period. So what they did was, which was very clever, is they looked at they did an analysis of land cover, forest land cover, between 2000 and 2010. They did some sort of empirical analysis that looked at land cover and how that changed as the concessions arose during that period of time. And then they ran a kind of counterfactual experiment. They estimated the impact of those concessions. Then they ran a kind of as-if counterfactual experiment. They said, okay, so if the moratorium had been in place in that period of time and on that piece of where those concessions were located, what would have been the impact of banning, the ban effectively? So while they don't assume that without the moratorium nothing happens, and without the moratorium there's complete devastation, and with the moratorium nothing happens, what they're looking at is the difference between what would have happened and what they and like 100% effectiveness compared to that baseline of the moratorium. It's a clever paper, and it's a good. I think it was a really interesting first attempt at trying to understand what the impact of this policy would be. But it has various shortcomings. Like, it doesn't look at the actual data. It focuses right on the concessions themselves. It doesn't look at the post-moratorium data. It assumes this 100% effectiveness against this baseline. So it's pretty, it was good, but it's, I think, certainly something that could be improved upon here using the data that we have up until now. So yeah, there are a number of other things as well. I mean, so their data is publicly available. We could have used those data, but we didn't, because it was it was clear they had made a few mistakes. We wanted to make our own mistakes. It's kind of inevitable that happened. So we wanted to build it up from the bottom using the Hansen data and so on. So we've done a completely independent sort of exercise here. All right. So our study is looking at post-moratorium data. We did program evaluation using actual outcomes. And we don't assume 100% effectiveness. We use the data of actually what happened there. And so we have a strong sense that our counterfactual is a more plausible estimate of what actually happened there. Okay, so what is the data that we use here? We use the Hansen Landsat data, which is a kind of collection of, I'm not sure what happened there. Huh. Okay, hang on. Yeah, this is what you're supposed to see right now. This thing here, I'm not quite sure why that disappeared. It's a global data set of land uses which was collected using the Landsat data. The database basically covers the entire globe, and it has information on tree cover, on forest loss, on forest gain, and sort of gain loss areas where you have plantations coming in and out and forests changing like that. So, clearly you can see from panel A there, it covers all the tropical areas, but also the boreal forests and in Central Asia and so forth. So it's a really, really incredible resource for looking at this kind of question on land uses. Okay, that's what happened. It comes and disappears, right? So obviously we have data from here for Indonesia. So you can see that right here. The sort of pink areas are looking at tree cover loss. It's very, very granular data down at the 30 meters squared level if you want it, and gives you information on gains and losses and so forth. So we use these data to do our analysis here. We overlay it with this is Indonesia. We overlay this with a kind of the shape files for the moratorium, which are available from the Indonesian government. So those are these pink areas here, right? So the Hansen data tells you, the shaded green tells you something about forest cover, right? And then the pink areas here show you it's very complicated actually, where the moratorium areas were. Okay, so these are the land which was designated as a ban on concessions in oil palm and logging and timber and so forth. Okay, so we have this incredible data. We have data which tells us something about the kind of geographical characteristics of all of ecological characteristics and so forth at these tiny fine-grained levels. And we can calculate distances from different places in order to control for different aspects of these data. Okay, all right. So we have a really fantastic data set, which, by the way, it shouldn't be underestimated how long it's taken us to put this data set together. But since the last presentation I did on this, and Lorenzo is the person who's been banging his head against the wall there, so he's done tremendous and sterling work on that front. Right. So how do we do this? We have a treatment area, we have a control area, we have some data over time. Of course, this is a perfect area for something else has gone wrong there. Sorry. So we have a perfect area for doing a kind of program evaluation, where we do quasi-experimental analysis here. And of course, this is clearly necessary in this context. So, the areas that were designated for the moratorium are going to be, qualitatively very different to those which aren't moratorium areas. You think about the economic process that's taking place, the kind of easy areas to convert will happen first, and those which have no longer been converted will happen later. And those are the areas that you want to sort of designate as which are often designated as protected areas, and in this case, the moratorium areas. So they're often very much more difficult and less suitable for conversion into any kind of economic activity. They're further away from cities. They have all of these different characteristics which are different. So it makes a like for like comparison very, 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 very not immediately obvious and straightforward. And there's this great paper by who is it? I know Paul Ferraro is one of the authors here, and down there it is, where he compared all of the different kind of methods. So a typical way of looking at this outside of sort of the economic sphere would be to just take the mean deforestation rate in the moratorium and compare it against the non-moratorium, and of course you get all of those confounding factors then. And what they showed in that paper was that if you use such simple naive estimators, you get sort of, in that particular case, they were looking at protected areas. You get a massive overestimation of how effective the program has been compared to one where you try and match cells together to make sure that all of the characteristics are the same, and the only thing that differs between them is the fact that one is a protected area and one isn't. So there's huge potential for overestimating the efficacy of these policies, and that leads us towards our kind of empirical strategy here. Of course, we have our moratorium areas here, these pink areas, and so this is a classic situation where we would like to use difference in difference design, right? And there are different ways in which you can do it. You do this parametrically, like this, where effectively what you're doing is you are looking at the trend in in the moratorium area. Let's say it's going in this direction. You look at the trend outside the moratorium area, and then you assume that what happened outside the moratorium area would have happened in the moratorium area. And this basically controls for a bunch of kind of sort of fixed effects, which and level differences in the levels at which these differences in these different areas as a way of identifying which part of that trend is due to the fact that it's a moratorium area. So that's a sort of parametric diff in diff. It relies on, so what the diff in diff is basically doing is saying, look, we look at this change in the moratorium forestation level, that's the F there, right, the mean change in forestation there, and we take away the mean change in the non-moratorium area, and that's our counterfactual. Okay, it relies on the fact that all of the unobservable stuff moves, the parallel trends assumption, all the unobservable characteristics move in the same direction, have the same trend as well, but that's often not the case. So what we are proposing here, and we're using some characteristics of the moratorium to do this, to help identify the impact of this program in a cleaner way. Imagine, so it turns out that the concessions, these red areas here, some of them are inside the moratorium area, and some of them are outside. Okay, and so, but as I said before, both concessions inside and outside can still do deforestation. So in a sense, these are like placebo areas which can be used. We can sort of use the difference in trends between these two, inside a concession area, inside and outside, to control for any background differences, fundamental differences that exist between moratorium and non-moratorium areas. Okay, so that's one kind of identification idea, and that gives us that leads us to a parametric triple diffs idea. So you have the diff in diff first of all, and then you take away the differences, the diff in diff between these placebo areas which shouldn't be affected by the program, but in case there's a background difference in trends between those two places, you strip that effect out as well. Okay, so when you do that, you can do that parametrically, where we're using our concession areas inside and outside the moratorium area to as you see, to identify our impact of the program more cleanly. Okay, so that kind of can solve a parallel trends assumption. You can do this parametrically. You can do it non-parametrically. A typical way of doing it is to do matched diff and difference instead of running this regression equation. What you do is, and this is what we do as well, is you find a cell, an area in the moratorium, a grid square in the moratorium. You match it on the basis of a bunch of different kind of relevant characteristics to a cell in the non-moratorium area, and then you see how these two areas change over time, and you take away the trend outside from the trend inside, and that is the effect, the matched effect. Take the average over all of these cells, and that's your matched diff in diff effect. A bunch of different people have done this. It comes from a sort of Heckman's paper in the late 90s. Nice paper by Chabet-Ferret and Subavi in GEAM, which does this for agricultural land use policies. Austin et al. Have done this for the Indonesian case. Andem et al. Did a whole bunch of stuff. That's the Ferraro paper. Andem and Ferraro et al. They all do this. So you try and match together cells one for one or in some other way, basically. And that's what these W functions are here. You're just sort of matching together the changes over time. Okay, so you can do that. That's a kind of just diff in diff type analysis, or you can do triple diffs and you can take away some other difference that you think is happening in a placebo group, just like I explained before. And there are two possibilities here. One, you can do the kind of spatial placebo using the concessions there. You look at the concession inside the moratorium and outside, and if there's any difference in the trends between them, you strip that out as well. The idea being that tells you something about what would have happened in the non-moratorium area, so you shouldn't attribute that difference to the program because it would have happened anyway. You can do it that way, spatially, or you can do it temporally. This is the Chabet-Ferret Subavi approach as well. So you look at a sort of placebo period of time before the program started. You look at the moratorium area and the non-moratorium area, and if there's any difference between them, it's an indication that the parallel trends assumption doesn't hold, and you strip that out of your analysis, your estimate later on. So that would be an appropriate thing to do if you think the parallel trends assumption is not satisfied in some way. Okay, so we do a bunch of these different kind of estimators which control for different things, different aspects in different ways with different levels of flexibility. And as the paper before showed you, the choice of estimator is really, really crucial here in identifying the impact. You run the risk here of really overestimating the effect if you don't get this right. Okay, so we do our matching procedures on the basis of a propensity score, which is basically a probability of being in or out of the moratorium area. So you run so I'm looking at this diagram here, tells you something. This is from the Austin paper on Indonesian forestation. The blue areas are let's say the existing oil palm plantations, and then the greener areas are the areas where there's a high risk of deforestation, which are very close to the moratorium areas actually. But so these are the things which determine whether or not you're likely to. There's a risk of a particular area being converted, right? And so these are the things which determine in some way which areas get chosen and selected to be part of the moratorium. And so these are the kinds of variables that we're trying to match these cells together inside and outside of the moratorium area, so that we compare like with like when we look at the impact. We use things like forest cover. We use pre-treatment variables as well, forest cover 2003, 2004, 2005. We use distance to concession. We use distance to roads and cities. These are things which determine the risk. You're trying to have a cell inside the moratorium area which has very, very similar characteristics in terms of being converted into a concession as those outside of the moratorium. Then we look at ecological variables like altitude and peak depth and slope and things like that. And we estimate a logic model which gives us a propensity score, the likelihood of being part of that. And then propensity score matching basically puts things together by looking at by getting a cell inside and outside of the moratorium area, which has a very similar probability. Okay, and what we use is one-for-one matching with a caliper, very narrow caliper, because we have so much data. We can be very, very very, very precise in terms of how we match our cells together. Okay, so this is our empirical strategy. We run a bunch of these different diff and estimates which try and get rid of all of the different confounding effects which exist between moratorium and non-moratorium areas. One first thing we do is we narrow the sample down. We trim the sample down to the areas under 1,000 meters in altitude, right? We do peatland and dryland areas separately because they have different qualities in terms of suitability for concessions and so on. We look at only virgin forest cells and virgin forests and concessions. We define that as being a cell with 60% plus of primary forest in 2005. Okay, so we're trying to look at those cells which are apt to be converted, essentially. This gives us something like 600,000 cells to deal with, 400,000 after these filtering aspects here. We then, when we run the matching, sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes some of the moratorium cells are so different from the non-moratorium cells, you can't find a partner for it. And that process of matching actually drops a bunch of data sets out because they're just completely incomparable off the scale. So that drops about 6% of the data as well. We have, in the end, we have 27% of our cells are around about that of moratorium, and then 73% are non-moratorium areas. We run all of those diff type estimators, and we run we do something in buffers close to, I'll explain that later, close to the concessions, and then we do some robustness tests as well. I don't have much to report on the robustness tests in this presentation, but you can ask me about that and we can talk that through. Okay, So hopefully I'll kind of convince you that we're doing something kind of quite precise and trying to get rid of all of the confounding effects to estimate the impact on forested land, on deforestation of this moratorium. Has it done anything in Indonesia? Okay, so here's time on the x-axis and forest cover on the y-axis, and the green line here is virgin forest inside the moratorium. And the red is virgin forest outside the moratorium. So you can already see, because the moratorium is higher than outside the moratorium, that there's a difference in the quality in the state of these different areas already. So there is some kind of selection going on. You know, the moratorium already has higher levels of forest cover, right? The other thing you notice from this is both of them are downward sloping, right? So these are whatever we tell you now is in the background. In the background is deforestation is happening quite rapidly, right? Well, I don't know whether I can say quite. I don't know what the definition of rapidly is, but it's definitely happening. And over that sort of a 15-year period, you know, you lose 12 percentage points of forest cover in Indonesia, in the area that we're looking at here. Okay, the diff in diff measure here basically takes the change in the moratorium area and takes away the change in the non-moratorium area. So it's AB minus EF, right? That's what diff in diff does in a parametric sense. These are like averages for this area, and this strategy only works if you've got parallel trends beforehand, right? So which you don't really have here. You see that actually the rate at which deforestation is going ahead is different in the non-moratorium area compared to the moratorium area. So these trends are not really parallel, which then ruins the identification assumption for diff in diffs, because you would attribute this divergence to the program, whereas in fact it was happening already. Okay, so then we look at the concession area. This is our spatial placebo, and we can look at the moratorium concession and the non-moratorium concession. And you see that actually these should have no effect. The moratorium itself should have no effect because both of these areas can be deforested, but they're also diverging at this very, very similar rate. So what we use is we correct the measure of diff in diff by using a diff in diff in diff, by taking away this trend here in the concession placebo area. Okay, so that captures something which would have happened anyway in the background. And then, so in the end, what you have is a diff in diff in diff estimator, which is AB minus EF and minus CD minus GH. Okay, so that's the kind of idea behind a triple diffs, is that you're trying to make the identification assumptions hold for diff in diff. Okay. All right, so here's our, we do that, we implement the simple diff in diff and then parametric diff in diff and triple diffs, non-parametric and parametrically. And here are some of our results here, okay? So these are the hectares within a 1.2 kilometer square. So our grids are 1.2 by 1.2 kilometers. And these are the number of hectares that you get as a consequence of I say as a consequence. This is what the diff in diff measure tells you is happening. The additional hectares of forest that you have in the moratorium compared to the non-moratorium. The triple diffs, as I said, strips out that non-parallel trends, and so the effect is diluted some more. Then you go to the non-parametric, which is matching one for one these grids to make them like to make sure that they're very, very similar. We're comparing like with like, and again that reduces the impact even more because you're getting rid of a whole bunch of other confounding elements there. And then finally you have the diff in diff, which is here is the kind of temporal triple diffs, which strips out the non-parallel trends at the start. These non-parametric and triple D estimates are the ones that I think are the ones we should be using here, because they deal with those identification problems that I've described about non-parallel trends and so on. So you end up with 0.7 0.76 hectares in each grid. That's 0.37%, let's say 0.4% of the deforested area. Very small, right? Very small impact. Okay, so if you look at, that's in dryland areas. If you look at peatland areas, it's quite a very similar story, except when you get to the non-parametric diff in diffs and the triple diff measures, these are very small and somewhat negative effects here. So the moratorium is having the opposite effect as to what you intended, right? And this has something to do with the fact that these are peatland areas. I think we discussed this morning. It's an unexpected result. Again, I would prefer. I think the one that we should be thinking about here is the triple diff, which basically is 0, right? 0.1. Okay, so what these results are telling us is that the moratorium has had a very, very small effect, I'd say, on deforestation, changing deforestation in Indonesia, in that area that it was applied to. In fact, another way of thinking about that is saying that those trends, once you strip out those what would have happened anyway, they end up being identical impacts. So this is a bit depressing. There's something going on for dryland areas. There's something probably close to 0 going on for peatland areas, I'd say. That's what our results are telling us. That's for the moratorium area as a whole. It's an average treatment on the treated effect. So what's happening inside that area, really. Okay. So that's one thing. Next thing is thinking about some spatial issues here. So first of all, I mentioned this before.
The moratorium. That's the take-home message.
Has someone got a question, or are they accidentally? Someone got a question?
I don't think so.
All right. I just got a brief glimpse on someone's life there for a second. Anyhow. Now let's look at some spatial issues. So before I told you that the likelihood of converting of an area becoming a concession was higher next to concession. So what we did now is to see whether or not that was true in our data as well. So we matched areas very close in various bandwidths away from a concession to see whether or not the moratorium had a higher or lower effect there. Our prior here was that these are high-risk areas which were highly likely to be turned into concession areas, and so that the impact, if you're going to see it, would be higher there than anywhere else, because the moratorium would cancel out those changes in the moratorium area, but they would continue in the non-moratorium area. Okay, when you look at these buffers at 1.2 kilometers, and in that 1.2 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20, what you find is that actually very close to the concessions, these with the triple difference, it's negative, strongly negative, or close to 0. So the impact is not bigger at all. But once you move further away from the moratorium area, this is the impact becomes closer to what we had for the area as a whole. So what's going on is that the impact that we measured before, which was relatively low for dryland and peatland areas, is really being driven not by the areas close to the concessions. And in fact, there is some, if you look at this, there's some evidence to suggest there might even be a negative effect going on close to the concessions there, okay? So speculative points here, because this is all very reduced form and we don't have any kind of structural model here to think about what is actually going on, but there's a low impact of the moratorium close to the concessions. Moratorium is ineffective there, it tends to suggest. This could be where illegal activities are happening, so it's been sort of blunt and instrument right there, the moratorium. This is exactly where activities might happen to try and change the designation of land from concession to non-concession to concession, or from primary to secondary forests, so that they no longer fall under the moratorium. So there's some other things, but they sort of suggest that the regs don't bite. So this is something which is up for discussion. We're sort of speculating a bit here about what this result means. Okay, other spatial issues as well. One thing you might be concerned about in an area-based policy like this is that there's some sort of spillover, right? That the designation of a moratorium bans activities in this area, but it just happens somewhere else, right? And typically you would find that along the borders of the moratorium. And so what we do here is we do, and this is complicated because you can see here the moratorium areas in this map are the kind of light green areas. It's a complicated web of boundaries and borders. But so what we do here is we do a regression discontinuity analysis along the borders of the moratorium area to see whether or not there's a significant change post-moratorium in the levels of deforestation just outside of the moratorium area. They're spilling over into that area there. Again, this is not straightforward to code, so hats off to Lorenzo for doing this, but he did, and these are the kind of results that we got here. So how can we read this? On the x-axis here is the distance to moratorium border. The blue is the non-moratorium area, and actually this is slightly confusing. It says deforestation rate here, but actually this is forestation. It's forest cover here, so it's the opposite of that. Actually, sorry about that. But the blue area is the non-moratorium, and the red area is the moratorium area. So, and this is the first one is 2004. The one on the right is 2014. Okay. So what this is basically doing is getting a local estimate of the impact either side of the moratorium boundary to see whether there are any kind of spillovers would happen. If there were spillovers taking place, conceptually you'd expect the line to be much higher at this border for the moratorium area, for the non-moratorium area compared to the moratorium. You'd expect activities to show up just on this border. It's the opposite of that. So two things about this. The red line is higher than the blue line. That means that actually forest cover is much higher in the moratorium areas compared to the non-moratorium, on average, around all of those borders of the moratorium there. Okay, so that's one thing. Secondly, there's not much difference. There's a gap here, but it doesn't really change much over time. So we don't notice post. I'll show you that just now. We need to look at this gap over time to see whether or not this has changed, to see whether or not there's a spillover effect here. And if you do that, this is a measure over time of the discontinuity estimate here between the moratorium and the non-moratorium area, and it basically stays the same. These are pixels on the y-axis here, of which in our grids there are 1,600, and you're looking at 1 or 2 pixel differences. And none of them really change. It doesn't change in the moratorium year or afterwards particularly, okay? So this we use as evidence to suggest because this discontinuity doesn't change, there's no spillover effect taking place, okay? All right, so that's interesting. So that's our regression discontinuity analysis at the border of the moratorium. Now, what's interesting here is that this is all about carbon, and the Norwegians are interested in carbon. The red plus concept is all about sort of reducing emissions through deforestation and degradation. And so what we do now is we it's been saved by the moratorium here. Okay, so first up you'd think, well, not much, right? So those percentages were very, very small, but of course we're looking at quite large areas, and so once these aggregate up, they aggregate up to somewhat. Are you still with me? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we're still here, Ben. But just to let you know, there's 15 minutes until the end, so if you
yeah, I'm nearly done.
Sweet, then we can ask some questions.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so this is the same table as I had before with dryland areas, but now underneath here I've got the area of affected and the carbon that we associate with that. These are kind of real back of the envelope calculations using standard conversion factors for this particular type of forest. And what we end up with, and these are you end up with sort of 70. So I'm thinking on focusing on the triple diff measures here, because they deal with the parallel trends. Something between 160 and 57 million tons of carbon sequestered and emissions avoided as a consequence of the moratorium in dryland areas. If you look at so this is how those estimates differ in terms of the estimator that we use. So if you use diff in diff and you don't deal with that kind of non-parallel trends assumption, you're really going to overestimate the efficacy of this program. Whereas if you look at the non-parametric triple diffs, which deal with that, and the triple diffs which deal with that, then they're much lower. Okay, so this is a comparison of estimators. With the peatland areas, again, these are made basically zero. In fact, arguably, these are larger. There's more emissions in those areas, according to our work so far. But I'm saying between sort of 54 and 3.8 million tons of carbon. Right. So that's our carbon estimates here. So how do we understand that? That's not easy to understand what these millions mean, right? So what these are the calculations in total, right? You sum these up over for the different estimators, and I'm looking at these black estimators as being my sort of favorite ones, which give us a sort of boundary of how much is being emissions are being saved. So between sort of 280 and 50 for in total over those 7 years, and if you take that annually, that's 35 million tons, or between 6 and 35 million tons. If you add in the below ground carbon, that goes up by a factor of 0.24. Again, this is very rough, right? So compare that to Bush's estimates, which was sort of the maximum was 615 million tons compared to 241. That was over the period of 2000 to 2010, summed up, right? So they're lower than Bush, these estimates, in terms of carbon, partly because the time horizon is 2 years, 2 years less, but partly because, of course, Bush's estimates were 100% effective, sort of had 100% effectiveness of the moratorium there. And so our estimates about exactly what happened on ground are showing us that this is much less effective by, in some cases, an order of magnitude. Okay, so that's one thing. We still don't have this in terms of scale. Let's put this in terms of percentages. Percentage of annual emissions that have been reduced by the moratorium, 1.4%, 0.3%, somewhere between that, very small. Percent of annual deforestation emissions, it's between 2 and 0.4%. Percent of the annual target based on 2019 emissions, it's somewhere between 6.3 and 1.2%. And if you include the below ground, it's something between sort of, let's say, 8% and 1.5% of that target. So it's really not doing anything remotely close to the stated target of reduced emissions. That's important because most of the emissions in Indonesia, the target here, this is from an OECD report, the 26% target would be to have an annual, every year, a reduction in compared to business as usual of 672 million tons, right, of carbon. It's mainly coming from forestry and peatland compared to other sectors, you see. So it's really important that this sector does this well, and the moratorium is only contributing a little bit to that. You think about value for money, finally, the Norwegians were paying $5 per ton of carbon, they said, based on what happened in 2018. And they thought, if you look at their 56 million and see what they got, what they were paying for in our case, well, in the lowest sort of possible case, where they get the lowest sort of reduction in carbon, they end up paying something like $6 rather than the $5, right? But in other cases where in the upper bound there, they're getting more, bigger bang for the buck than they anticipated, and they're only paying 0.2 or $1 for, depending on whether you look at this annually or over the long term. So they're not hitting their targets, but the Norwegians are sort of getting what they want. That's basically what these are basically saying. So I'll conclude there. The moratorium has had a small but positive effect on carbon emissions and deforestation in dryland areas. against a background of steady deforestation over time, significant selection problems. The methods are super important here, but the small impact compared to the overall stated targets of 26% reduction by 2020, which, oh, by the way, that's now. And so Norway has paid, something like, if you apply the 56 million to the reductions of the moratorium that we've estimated, they're paying between $6 and $1 per ton of carbon, whereas they anticipated they were paying $5. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Ben. That was ace. So we'll just open up now to questions. And so
I think there is a question from Brett in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Brett, do you want to go ahead and ask that? And then anyone else, if you want to ask a question, the best way to do it is if you can, hopefully you can raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, if you go onto the participants and then raise your hand through that, or just put something in the chat, either of those works.
And I'll keep sharing my screen in case someone wants to see one of the slides. Okay.
Sounds great.
Hi, Ben. Thanks so much. Lovely presentation. And to Charlie and Lorenzo, I understand we're much involved in the work. I was just interested in trying to get some sort of understanding of what's happening to the Norwegians' money, the mechanism through which this payment is supposed to deliver the change. Are there some sort of incentive payments to those who might deforest, or is it all based on some form of, I think you've got my question, I'll leave it there. But
yeah, sure.
is it being prosecuted here? What's going on?
Yeah, so it happens at a very high level. The negotiations happen at a very high level, central government level, and it gets filtered down to local administrations. It's quite decentralized. The person you want to talk to here about this really is Charlie, but there is a thing called the Green Fund through which this money gets channeled for green purposes. And then beyond that, one never, as far as I can understand, once it gets down to the kind of provincial and district level, one never really quite knows what's going on. Maybe Charlie wants to chip in there. Maybe he's not here. He might not be here.
No, I'm here. I'm here. Oh God.
Sorry,
it's Cameron.
Oh, hello, Charlie.
Hello. All right. Yeah. So this is So it has been. This money is going to go into a new kind of government agency at national level, and from there, I think the money is supposed to go into various initiatives. I think to sort of people who control forests through their local communities and so on. But for sure, it's not going anywhere near the concessionaires. So this is not an incentive directed towards concessionaires. Originally, we thought the money would be helped to boost enforcement capacity. And I think some of the upfront money that was paid out in 2011 was to kind of set up a monitoring verification type system. So we have some idea of what's going on, but that's only just been established. I mean, the monitoring capacity in Indonesia really just comes down to the satellite data, and that's it. Very little enforcement capacity is supposed to be done by the districts. There's no evidence of any benefit sharing between the national government and the local government, which should obviously help in terms of enforcement. So it's a little bit weird. There is definitely an institutional weakness in this policy, but for sure, from the very beginning, it was up to the Indonesians how they spent the money. So the Norwegian did not dictate that the Indonesians spend the money in any particular way, right? It was all a case of, if you manage to make the moratorium work, we will give you some money. That was the basis upon which the moratorium payments were going to be made.
And can I follow up, Ben? I'll assume that's yes.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm sure you're chairing. So is there any sort of you looked at what they're paying per carbon, but I'm sort of harking back to a question that Ian asked earlier on the chat, which was whether there was an efficiency gain here, like the amount of money, if you had some idea of what purchasing land was, or trying to take land out of the possibility of being deforested. There's the quantity of money you need to do that, and the carbon you get from that, smaller or larger than the amounts that Norwegians are putting through this route. I mean, I'm curious about whether there's any efficiency in going through this route of paying to national government compared to something else. That wasn't very well phrased, but just
that's a really good question. We haven't looked at that, right? We haven't looked at whether or not on the incentive side, whether or not this is enough money to to do that, or in terms of social welfare, whether or not what's knocked out from the ban is causing more, causing a reduction per se. It's a really good question. I would say that, judging by the amounts of money which are changing hands here, they have pledged $1 billion, but this is sort of peanuts for such a large scale scheme, right? This is really nothing. So I don't, the money itself is not doing it, but I guess and this goes down to who benefits from the social, the social gains of reducing carbon emissions here. We all benefit from that. And those benefits are spread incredibly widely and not really focused, it seems, down in Indonesia. Right?
Can I just add to that the $1 billion that would put up front for this, in terms of forest conservation funding, this is off the scale, and it's the same thing with the agreements the Norwegians made with Brazil and Guyana and other countries. Like, it's just, conservation money by comparison, peanuts. But the alternative, the concessions industry, as I was saying to Ben earlier, it's economically and politically very powerful. I mean, palm oil alone contributes $12 billion per year in exports, right? It employs hundreds of thousands of smallholders and other people, millions of people actually across the whole country. So, there's a lot riding on these industries. And so the $1 billion is kind of pretty rubbish compared to the alternative, if that helps to address the question.
Well, I mean, I should have started by saying that your analysis is very convincing, and so my next question is, well, why isn't it working? So,
this is a good question. I get, so clearly there's the way in which the program is implemented on the ground is a mystery to me, actually. But one would anticipate that there's fairly weak institutions and a lack of enforcement of any kind of ban down there. But Charlie, I mean, my understanding from this is coming from conversations with Charlie, really. So that's one thing. And you're swimming against the flow, I would expect, just as we've discussed. It's these are powerful industries which are local governments and local forestry groups are not. Don't have the power to sort of stand up against those. So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. Plus the incentives either to do that. So yeah.
But it's a start, right? That's kind of one way of seeing it. Indonesia doesn't have a good track record in conservation, and you could see this as a kind of a start to bringing in a culture of conservation into the Ministry of Forestry, for example, which has always been kind of geared up towards exploitation and extraction and not protection. So there is a sort of more generous way of interpreting these results. It's something better than nothing. Can we improve from there? Have we got enough time? And so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, so we had similar experience with the ETS in Europe, right? It didn't change things overnight. It had some significant teething problems and was a learning process as well. And that's in Europe, where institutions and information is much better, I would say. So we could be in that phase here in terms of how the moratorium is working in Indonesia. And that was something that came up in discussion earlier today with Charlie and Lorenzo. That's we don't want to be negative about this. We want to sort of be positive about it, but we also want to be accurate about it. So I think that's probably one way to think about it too. This is probably to do with institution building and the Norwegians. I guess the Norwegian intervention is pretty welcome on a global kind of stage, right?
I think just so we've got we've already run over, but I think Ian has one final question, and then we might just wrap up if that's all right with everyone else. So Ian, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. Unless there's any students from the course, want to jump in?
I don't think there was anyone else with a hand up or asking a question.
I suppose it is just another way of asking the efficiency question. I've only done a bit of work in Indonesia, but actually in Sumatra, and the corruption was just endemic, and money went in at the top, nothing came out at the bottom, and it seems like this is another example of it. Wouldn't they just be better taking their money, the Norwegians, and buying land? Charlie tells me they can't buy land in Indonesia. Go somewhere else that's nearby, that is again a carbon and biodiversity hotspot, and just buy the land and stop it being felled. Really, just seems like a much more effective way of doing this, much more certain, and also you get all the biodiversity benefits as well.
Well, look, I mean, if I can answer that, so on paper, it looks like a great kind of a potentially good solution, but raises a bunch of other issues as well. I mean, I imagine that the Norwegian outreach, which of course we've seen in Guyana as well, and so on, this precise discussion comes up very frequently, I imagine. You know, let's not do it like this, let's do it like this. But the political economy of that is, I think, is pretty difficult, right? It looks like, well, anyway, all it takes is, it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see that looks like a very, very sort of colonial move to play that kind of game. Whereas doing budgetary support for environmental purposes does not necessarily have that flavour to it at all. So the political economy is super important here as well, even though it may well be, practically speaking, in terms of that end goal, might be could be effective, you know.
I'm sure the orangutans don't care who it is that's saving them.
They don't. I don't think they're in the sort of around the table though. That's the problem, right? So that I mean, that would solve a lot of things probably, wouldn't it?
Anyway, great paper. Well done. A very, very interesting design. Well done.
Cheers, Ben. So have to leave discussion there. So it just kind of falls on me then to say thank you very much to Ben. We've got some other great speakers coming up as well. So next talk is in 2 weeks' time. It's Brendan Fisher on the use of behavioural economics in kind of conservation. But there's other brilliant talks coming up as well. So Gretchen Day on natural capital, Kelsey Jack on an RCT looking at harvesting the rain. Jason Lusk, I think, is going to be talking on food, and Antonio Bento's kind of confirming his soon. But yeah, so some excellent talks coming up, and it'd be great to see you there.